is the Olympic Files, and I'm Al.
And I'm Theo.
And you're Theo. And don't ever forget it.
Yeah.
The thing I think that not sticks in our craw so much, but just find it unfortunate that George Orwell, or Eric Blair, has been seen as either just a science fiction writer who maybe got lucky, or somebody who actually was a proponent of the not-so-pleasant things that he saw in the future. Let me ask you, when you were in high school and you were behind me, did you read 1984?
I don't think we did, but I'm also sure that if we had, I would not have paid attention to it.
Well, that's true. But why wouldn't you pay attention to it? I can tell you why I would, but what about you?
Yeah, pretty much the same reason, yeah.
Well,
they shouldn't really, people that age, they should not even waste their time trying to teach them novels of that depth. Honestly, they should stress the grammatical part of English more. And not only that, I don't think they should force any novel on them at all. Let them choose their own. Okay, I'm all for that. But it's the same principle as, compulsory education at all. People, it's human nature to resent what is forced upon you.
Well, I think the problem there, as far as enjoying both 1984, which we didn't get in high school, but we did get Brave New World. The problem with both those books, they're to a special genre, in a sense, that I think can only be fully appreciated by people who have experienced, shall we say, the human condition a bit longer than high school freshmen through seniors.
Yeah.
Freshmen.
I didn't start waking up till age 30. I don't know about you, and that's just when I started waking up.
No, at that point in time, I believe we were given it in the second semester of my senior year. And we were on a point system, so by the time we were done with the first half of the school year, or the equivalent of 2 semesters, I guess, my grades were locked and I was graduating. What that set up, though, is for me, who really was sick of school, I did practically nothing. Now, that didn't do well for my final grades and my class rank.
Senioritis.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And it wasn't so much that I guess, and that's, we're not here to discuss this, but I mean, for me, it was I had enough of compulsory education. I mean, I just had enough.
Yep.
And I even told my English teacher, who was a very fine person, I said, listen, I'm sorry that I'm not attentive, and there were a couple others just like I was. We didn't cut up, but I mean, it was just that we weren't contributory and maybe somewhat benignly, recalcitrant or in opposition. I mean, we just weren't there. And I just said to her, I said, listen, it's not you, and I'm sorry it had to be this way at this time, and it had to be you. I said, but I'm sick of it. Most of us are here. And to give us something of this depth. And the other thing she had us do is Chaucer's Tales. And I was like, are you serious? I mean, come on, you do that in September. I mean, I got a hard enough time with the regular English, let alone going back to old or middle. And I just said, that's the system, and it's nothing against you, but I've had it.
18-year-old men that we're requiring to still be in high school, historically it's ridiculous. It was very common for Pony Express writers in the 1800s to have been 13 years old. And John Taylor Gatto writes a lot about this, the delayed adulthood of Americans nowadays, and that's probably why American adults watch cartoons so much now on television. It's unnatural.
Well, I'll tell you what, we actually should earmark this discussion for a separate file by itself.
Sure, yeah.
But I will say also I find it interesting that at a time when it's probably good to not keep students in school for 10 to 12 hours, that's exactly what's happening. And I find it interesting because school has become, in essence, a parent. And you know the old story about it takes a village to raise a child. The school system is where propaganda is injected into these children.
If you want to brainwash the child, it takes a village, yeah.
Right. So I mean, like, they should be They should be going into school for exactly what they need and get out, just like it is in college. I mean, when you stop at the phys ed, it doesn't work. I mean, you know the joke of it. I mean, how can you go into a one period, 45 minutes long, change, do something that's going to make you sweat, get back in, shower, and get out again? It doesn't work. You know, nobody cares. It doesn't help anything. So, at any rate, but I find it interesting that a number of states, I think about 6 or 7, are going to go with a school year now that's going to extend it like something like 28 to 30 days. That's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, it may be by the hours. The days get longer. They may not be going to school more days, or they may. I don't know. But it's like, you got to be kidding me, Jack. So
that may mean their parents also are working so many more hours.
Well, that's the excuse they're going to use. Every time there's a breakdown or continued breakdown of parental control, the school has to do this. Well, we got to feed them. And we have to keep them after because they're latchkey kids. I don't care. There's another place for them to be outside school, whether it's whatever they want to do, or working, God forbid. So, at any rate, I find that interesting that's going in that direction. But that is what was foretold. So I understand why this is happening. Although you can imagine right now, especially among educators, there's an outcry against this. Oh,
but. To sum it up, at the high school level, almost to a student, they don't care about these novels. You could improve it again by letting them choose one for themselves. Give them a list of classic novels. Say, choose one, read it by next so-and-so. But instead, we uniformly force the whole class to read one at one time. They resent that.
Well, do what we did. Have one person in the group read it and then share with the rest, and then the next time there's a book, somebody reads it, and they share it with everybody. So you only have to do one book a year, pretty much. But getting back to not understanding Orwell, and then I'll tell you, we had Brave New World, and it wasn't taught as anything except just kind of like a futuristic book. It wasn't seen as an allegory. It wasn't seen as a warning. We've gone back and forth about the difference or the similarities about Orwell and Huxley. I think they both had a concern for what was to come, but I mean that didn't make it with us. We didn't perceive that. We had no idea that we were living in matrices, and that one day we would be enslaved again. That would not have made sense to us in the late '60s, although we had enough problems with Vietnam. So,
but that's what started this idea for this discussion was this particular essay written in 1945 by Orwell predicted. It said that we are now entering, as of 1945, as of the invention, and because of the invention of the atomic bomb, the world has now just embarked upon what Orwell said was a period of prolonged, horrible stability of centralized government.
Right. All right. Now, a couple of years ago, we kicked back the information that was in the book by Ian Slater, The Road to Airstrip 1.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you finish that?
Yeah, and I got it all marked up, and yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very revelatory. But the one thing that always struck me, and it's funny, after I had done a series on that, and I got directed to some blogs, but one in particular I had to laugh because, you have the one bully that just drops into the blog and was ripping me up one side and down the other. And I'm like, well, why am I getting ripped? I mean, whatever it is, it comes with the territory. I understand that. But in this case, all I was doing was reading some excerpts from the book. Now, the fact that I read them may mean I agree with them, and probably I did. But I did not opine anything. We went and rehashed it. And somebody in the blog kind of like meekly said to the bully, well, he's just, reading Slater's work. So, and you know how that goes. And then the guy disappears. And, if it's a guy, who knows what it is in the wonderful world of the Internet. But still, Orwell is misunderstood. And the one thing we're looking at today is the essay that was published on October 19th, 1945. That date is critical. The essay was entitled You and the Atomic Bomb, and it can be read on, Orwell.org?
If you do a search for it, that's one of them. There are at least 2 sites it'll come up on. Another point of interest is if you go into Barnes & Noble or Borders Books and you look for, or even Amazon for that matter, if you're looking for there are 2 or 3 mainstream book publishers who put out compilations of Orwell's essays. This essay is not found in those popular compilations. It's kind of funny. Whoever owns the rights to Orwell's work, and according to some sources I find on the internet, it's the Fabian Society. But they don't like to include this essay, nor do they like to include other stuff that Orwell has written, say, on James Burnham or H.G. Wells, a couple of other essays I can think of.
Well, yeah, in the state that we're in, everything's peculiar. And I'm not saying that it isn't. But you wonder sometimes if that is a suppression. That's where you're going with that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, who knows? But sometimes things are conspicuous by their absence. But going back to Orwell, and I'm going to let you just sum up, because I remember when you came upon it and kind of were processing it years ago, and realized that Orwell was probably, I'll say it, I think he was friendly to us, and I'll say no more.
Yeah, he was a socialist, for certain, but
that doesn't make him bad.
No, I mean, this was at a time when more people thought that could work. Every time he saw the common man being oppressed, he stood up for it. He stood up for it so much that he actually put his own butt on the line in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, how many people would volunteer, put their own butt on the line, and he almost got killed by a millimeter, literally, over it. All of his books, almost all of them, they were written to alert the public as to the plight of some or other group of oppressed people. That, to me, sounds like somebody who cared about people. Now, personality-wise, he was aloof. He was a stoical person, but if you read his work and what he was writing about, it's obvious he was very passionate about people, defending people.
I guess some of the things he had seen and experienced shaped that. I don't think he was all that cool with the colonial system that the Brits had at that time. It was fading, perhaps, in one sense, but that's for another time. And of course, whatever he saw in the Spanish Civil War. But I think, see, here's what I find very interesting. For as much as he called it, as far as what was coming for us, this totalitarianism, and I would say he has some gaps, though, or what I would call gaps, in that whole line of thinking. And what I'm saying is, does he not know that governments are all handled, they're all corrupt? And he makes reference to the success of the American Revolution, and I'm like, what success? And that's where we're at. I mean, I know you believe that, and so do I, and for good reason. But it seems that he actually believed that was organic and that it had worked. And that I find interesting. And there's a few things that pop up with that. We can't hold his feet to the fire for thinking like we do. But I do find that somebody who knew the program, understood the program, knew the secret handshake, that he would actually think some of these things were up and up. Your thoughts on that? Yeah,
he does reference what he believed as the successful American Revolution. You're right. And there is a little bit of a contradiction, because unless he's going to acknowledge, or he would have acknowledged, that at some point in American history that changed, because later on in the essay he writes, let me look at this, about, he was writing here in the essay about how, and this is what also Burnham had written earlier, that the world as of 1945 was shaping up to be 3 unconquerable superpowers. Russia, the U.S., and China, of course. And he writes of these 3 superpowers, they are each self-contained and cut off from contact with the outer world, and each ruled under one disguise or another by a self-elected oligarchy. He's referring to also the United States there,
right,
ruled by a self-elected oligarchy. So although he believes he apparently, like everybody else, has swallowed the propaganda about the American Revolution. He acknowledges that at that point in history, the U.S. was lost to oligarchical dictators.
Or, you know,
now, had he access to the I-Man stuff today in Montgomery, I'm sure he'd come around about the American Revolution, I would guess.
What Theo just referenced, the works of The Informer and James Montgomery, can be found, if you've never read them, on thinkerbeaten.com, and just look for the two names, The Informer or James Montgomery. Montgomery's book that's online called A Country Defeated in Victory, I think everybody should read. It's going to shake everything you believe, and you know what? It should be shaken.
That's one of them, of Montgomery's work, and the other one is The United States is Still a British Colony. It contains within it, each of the chapters has a different title, and it has the best chapter title of any book I've ever come across. The title, Bend Over, America.
Yes. Thank you, sir. May I have another? Oh, that
yes.
brings you back to college. Well, he might have also used those revolutions as what he knows that people have generally consumed as being real. Maybe he didn't believe it, but at least that was a reference point he knew others would accept. And maybe the case, too. I don't know.
Yeah.
But what I find so interesting in this essay, it's at the core of some debates, discussions, disagreements, and other kind of dung-throwing fights that we got into as to whether or not the people, let's just say here in the United States, would rise up when they get a heads up about what is going on. And when they do they think that you can band together in militias or whatever, committees of vigilance with weaponry and somehow stave off totalitarianism and a government that's gone bad? And my point was, no, that day is over with. And it was probably over with every minute that went by after the end of the World War II. And I'm looking here. I don't want to, read gigantic chunks of this.
There were three brief eras in history, he points out, where the common man had a chance at a successful revolution, could throw off his oppressors. And those three eras he cites are the era when the longbow was the supreme weapon, then the era when the musket was the supreme weapon, and then the era when the rifle was just invented and was the supreme weapon. And you did, if you look at history, that's when the governments, they really had a fight on their hands from the peasants. And every other point in history, all the other points in history, the weak had no claws, is the way Orwell puts it.
Yeah, I mean, here, I guess, let's see, he states, this was a comparatively complex thing, but it could still be produced in scores of countries, and it was cheap, easily smuggled, and economical of ammunition. Even the most backward nation could always get hold of rifles from one source or another. But thereafter, every development in military technique has favored the state. Has favored the state as against the individual, and the industrialized country as against the backward one. And that's the point. In the old days, you had bows and arrows, I had bows and arrows.
Yeah.
You had a long rifle, and I had a long rifle. And then if that's the case, if the weaponry is at least even, the people can win because of the size and numbers, and one would think in time the reluctance of a military to kill its own people. But that isn't happening anymore. And the thing that we talk about, obviously, and what I have said to these folks that we've disagreed with, and that is, it's not that way anymore. I mean, you can take out your AK-47s or whatever you want, and you're going to face a fighting force that it doesn't even use bullets.
Yeah, the last era when the commoner had a chance to successfully revolt was roughly the Boer War, because they could still get rifles, even though they didn't have what Orwell calls huge concentrations of industrial plant. Orwell notes that since that time, since the turn of the 20th century, all the new inventions of weapons are sophisticated, and they require huge concentrations of industrial plant. Those are Orwell's words, like battleships and bomber planes, and then the atomic bomb, and we'll talk about what they have today, which is far worse, of course. But the common man, they don't have factories. Only governments have factories. So you can't fight their weaponry. What are you going to go up against a B-2 bomber with the shotgun in your closet? It's not going to happen.
Well, interesting also that you mentioned the Boer War and that movie Breaker Morant.
That's a good movie.
Yeah, it's just passed through on the cable channels. And, of course, that's based on actual events. But what was key there was that, as some have explained it, the first phase of the Boer War went to the Afrikaners, I guess, the Dutch.
Yeah.
And the second round went to the Brits, who got their backside spanked and regrouped and came back heavily. But then there was a third phase, which was problematic, and that was the Afrikaners.
The concentration camp phase?
Well, along with that came that's the Brits who put the people in concentration camps. But that's when the opposition started to fight strictly on a guerrilla basis, and would hit and run and hit and run. And there's one episode in the movie which I think is emblematic of what went on, and that is they came riding in on a British fort, if you will, and had crude homemade bombs, rode in, had the element of surprise, and they were doing pretty well until eventually the soldiers got their stuff together because, I mean, they were like almost roused out of their morning sleep, and they had a machine gun. And it was interesting because the machine gun started to change the ebb and flow of the skirmish.
There you go.
And there, that's right. There's your mechanized weaponry that is kind of hard. And what that really does is, I think, when you use stuff like machine guns at that time, and even now with bombs or whatever, it will multiply the ability of one person to kill many.
Yeah.
So if you're 10 against 50 and you've got, a 50 cal machine gun, you're probably going to come out on top. So,
that's what the ignorant generals in World War I never did figure out.
I have to wonder sometimes, and again, this is an aside, about what wars were proving grounds for other wars. For instance, when they came out finally with the original Gatling gun.
Yeah, in the war between the states, right?
Yeah, and they kind of got it perfected, and then they went ahead and opened it up on native peoples. And even now, you wonder what the United States has done with weaponry outside the view of TV cameras and such in places like Iraq and, well, not Iran, but Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe even Pakistan.
Well, we should talk about that before we get out of here, because these stupid patriots of today, there's a line from Kurt Vonnegut, I forget which book, where he uses the line, "stuck in the amber of time." That is where the patriots, their minds are still in the musket age. It's not going to work today.
Yeah, there is a mass delusion, and we watched it. And there came a time for both of us, separately, I assume, where I realized that source of information and the Patriot Idiot networks and everything else, that are you stuck in another century for a particular reason? You can't possibly believe this. And if you do, I mean, what a horrible delusion to be under if you ever have to find face to face the reality of your miscalculation. And so, yeah, you look at that, and that's when I realized you're not going to stop this thing. Are you kidding me? I mean, it's so far advanced and so massive, and that's what I was going to say to you too. Not only is the weaponry different, and obviously an imbalance in its potency between the oppressed and the government or whatever, but it's also the inability to fight, as I was saying, the Afrikaners did or whatever, the Boers, with a guerrilla-type situation. How in the world could you work in a guerrilla-type situation today? I mean, we're getting more and more into a ubiquitous surveillance state. I mean,
exactly.
How do you just spring up out of somewhere and do something of meaningfulness and then disappear again? I don't know how you do that today.
You don't. We're surveilled constantly, a lot more than we realize.
Well,
and you can't coordinate anything.
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Think of the weaponry they have. The lasers, the chemical weaponry, the sonic weaponry, the weapons that can make crowds feel like their skin is on fire from hundreds of yards away. And you're going to fight that with bullets? And then, okay, so the John Bircher types, the Patriot Idiot types will say, well, okay, we'll go guerrilla and sneak in on the headquarters of whoever and poison them or whatever. How are you going to coordinate? They watch your every correspondence. They track your cell phones. Who knows what they can listen to auditorily.
Well, right, and that's in a particular situation here where we're really not at war or there's any kind of hitting going on. This is at a time when everybody's supposedly peaceful. Now we know
the NSA knows everything about them already.
Yeah. Well, you have no argument here, and that's why I'm saying. Another thing is that people have so much faith in the Internet because of the truth it broadcasts and all that, and that is true. But one of the problems with the Internet, and this is another point of debate that I went back and forth with folks, I'm like, yes, it's opened up a lot of people's eyes, but it's not enough to turn back the critical mass of all those whose eyes are still shut. And secondly, one of the real big problems now I've seen in the 10 years I've been involved in this, and that is there is so much information in general that it really becomes an obstacle. Now, a lot of it's deliberate, and a lot of it is just everybody popping off and having websites, not necessarily individuals. But as you know, I got some bugaboos about some sites that are up there because, and you know I work for one of them, and they have to generate interesting stuff, not necessarily true, but it's a lot of supposition and extrapolation that they pass off as news, and it is not. And they have to do that to make money. And as we've always said, once you inject money into the equation, every single time, truth is the first and biggest casualty. And one of the other things I heard of a couple of months ago, in this, somebody was breaking down a particular forum that was being held. And one of the problems for some of these people who are, in general, merchants, was the amount of bad information that's out on the Internet. And that is true. And that is also deliberate.
Oh, yeah, I think a lot of these... I think we'd be surprised at how many sites are COINTELPRO or whatever it's called nowadays, deliberate bad information that is ultimately sourced to the government. I think we'd be surprised at how much. But then on the other hand, it's human nature being what it is, there are just a lot of idiots.
That shows you the power of being anonymous. Everybody's a tough guy. Everybody's a brainiac. And for a lot of people, they do not divine between that which is true and that which is basically falderall. And that's a real problem. I'll give you an example, but first of all, there's nothing we can do to compete with mainstream news. And that would, yes, and I'm sorry, but that would include Democracy Now! And Guns and Butter, all these alternative, slightly to the left or, largely to the left, information sites and programs.
You mean just National Petroleum Radio?
The National Petroleum Radio stuff. It's just the same stuff. And actually, you and I have come to the conclusion, and I think rightfully so, that these Patriot Idiot networks are also in that now because they're suffering from the same stuff or employing the same techniques as the alphabet networks that they so bemoan and decry and bring calumnies against. So it's if you're going up for money, if it's got to be something viable and it can only be sustained economically, you're going to fall into the same category whether you're Patriot Idiot, whether you're alternative left, or whether you're mainstream. It's all the same thing. Maybe different levels of intensity, but it's the same stuff. Now, I'll give you an example about how slick, or not so slick, but it's always there, that the mainstream will fight any kind of conspiracy theory or actually conspiracy fact. Some article took to task some of the brainiacs in the conspiracy theory tinfoil hat wearing segment that was attacking a certain individual up in Sandy Hook that gave refuge to a number of children who had come out of the elementary school because of the obvious shooting. And so this article just whacked all those conspiracy types. And so of course they want to get some kind of authority involved in it to get a quote or two from. And they find somebody, and this person's statement was, for some people it's just too hard to understand that there's a simple reason for it. Occam's razor, that kind of thing. They don't believe that it was just one person who was involved in Sandy Hook, et cetera, et cetera. And then they throw in, it was like the same thing with people, who can't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. And I'm like, oh, that's perfect. That is perfect. You know what I mean? They got to throw that zinger in. It's like, holy mackerel.
Wow.
But what I had to laugh at is what's forgotten in all this. And this is really a strange but very small sidebar to that whole Kennedy assassination thing, is when, I guess because of Garrison's persistence, Ford led great. Whenever this comes from the government, it always works out well, right? But they came out with their own little commission and did decide that there was more than one shooter. And then they closed everything up and went away.
Was that the church committee in the 70s?
I don't know. Ford was, I think, it bore Ford's name. Church was involved, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 70s with what was going on with regard to, I guess, clandestine ops and stuff like that against American people.
Uh-huh.
That's what I affixed church to back in the 72 or so. But Ford led a commission, and they did come up with the fact. They said, yeah, there was more than one shooter, and everybody went away. And it never went anywhere. And we were all looking at each other like, huh? If there's more than one shooter, guess what? You have a conspiracy. And nothing happened.
Yeah.
Nothing happened.
Unless you beat it to death in the mainstream media 9 or 10 times a week, people don't listen. They'll broadcast that once or twice, and then have it go away.
What I find interesting in that whole thing, too, and this, again, is the power of the mainstream. When Oral Inspector came out with that ridiculous magic bullet thing, the car that he used, or was used for that demonstration, was not the same car, was not the same vehicle that Kennedy sat in. And so, of course, those who would believe Specter and the government story about a lone gunman would say it's no big deal. But had that been the other way around, and had somebody try to do that and show that the magic bullet theory was false, and I guess Garrison did try to do that, but had used a different car, what do you think would have happened to him?
Shut it!
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was 33rd degree Freemason Lee Iacocca that absconded with the real car.
Yeah, I wonder about that sometimes, but that is the story. And it wound up in Wright Pat, and then, or some say it went up to Detroit, up to Ford or whatever.
And you see what Specter got as a reward. He got a lifetime.
Yeah, he did.
lifetime guarantee as a senator. That was his reward.
Yeah, the closest he came to losing, I remember, I think it was in 2004. And I was staying up late that night because I got off work at 2 a.m. So I thought I'd watch all the craziness that takes place in the wee small hours of the morning, which is the morning after the election day. And Specter was losing, and I only remember an opponent was a female. That's all I remember. Don't remember any names. And I'm like, Specter's going to lose? Are you kidding me? I mean,
he's got tenure. No way.
Yeah, I mean, he's got the anointing, and the next morning he won. I mean, later that day he won.
Another late night switcheroo, huh?
Yeah, and I told you about the situation down here in Florida with Benny Casser going up against what's it? I forget his name. Oh, the guy that was ahead of HUD, Mel. Was it Fernandez? Well, anyway, he was a big Bush crony. And as I said, he had been involved with HUD. And I'm like, he's losing to Castor. And I saw Castor give an acceptance speech. And I'm like, holy mackerel. Did they fix it for the guy? A couple hours later, Mel won.
Did you ever read or hear of the book Vote Scam by the Collier brothers?
No, I didn't.
Oh, man, you'd like it. James and Kenneth Collier. They did some fine work. They died like 10 or 12 years ago. What they did was I think it was in the late 70s or early 80s. One of them ran just to see if the common guy off the street could do it. One of them ran for a Congress seat in Florida, while the other one worked on the campaign, was his publicizer. I can't say it.
Publicist, get it right.
Thank you, publicist. and they were more successful than they thought initially, and it was one of those things. They were the night of the election on television. The guy was leading. The Collier guy was leading, and then all of a sudden, late at night, there was a big switcheroo, and they were just flabbergasted. And so the incumbent won. And so the rest of the book reads like a detective novel, where for the next decade they searched, they went around and they tried to investigate the voting process itself and what happens. And what they found is that you the citizen, you can't even find out where your vote goes. They went to the National Women's Voters Association, the one that counts the votes, and the door was locked. They wouldn't let them in, and they tried to talk to Janet Reno, who was in Florida. This is before she was Attorney General, and Janet Reno would have nothing to do with them. And what they found is they had a tiger by the tail, and it says that on the dust jacket. They just scraped the iceberg of voting fraud. They experienced it for themselves, but it really reveals the surface of a giant election fraud process that happens in America all the time.
From now on, you fight my way. Dirty!
Whether it's physical ballots or whether it's electronic voting,
Yep.
there is no chain of custody throughout the whole process. It may be okay when it comes out of the town or the city to the county to the state, but there's no chain of custody, so you really don't know. And the thing is, and here's the real point, though. To go ahead and derail against the voting system is a waste of time. But they want you to do that. The overlords want us to do that because it takes away from the horrible truth that the people you're voting for suck anyway. I mean, the whole thing, whoever you're putting in D.C. is garbage. So what difference does it make who you vote for if they're all various forms of garbage? So who cares anymore? I mean, that's why I stopped voting, because the people that run this country don't run for office. So why am I going to worry about voting scams? They're going to put anybody who they want in anyway. And what seems to be a real lock on that whole situation, I'm sure everybody has asked themselves the wisdom of this. You remember when suddenly it popped up there was going to be early voting? What's that about? You know, not just on voting day, election day, but this early voting. Why in the world does that make sense? Well, vote early. Why? What's the big deal? But
often.
Huh?
And often.
Yeah, right. But the thing is, what that does now, and I think this is is definitely a result of the manipulation that failed in the elections of 2000 and 2004, when apparently the powers that be
got sloppy.
Well, they didn't discern how most Americans didn't really want Bush as president.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And twice they had to steal the elections, just like they stole it for Rutherford B. Hayes in '76, when they stole it for who else did they steal it for? Kennedy in '60, Truman in 52 or 48? 48, I guess it was.
48.
Yeah, 48. We were all told that it was just a miscount, or all the ballots didn't come in when you see Truman standing up in nighttime holding out the newspaper that says Dewey wins. Yeah, Dewey won. Yeah, Dewey did win.
With his big old 33rd degree Freemason smile all across his face. Yeah.
Harry doesn't mind.
Yeah.
And this is something that is definitely suspect, but I've often wondered if FDR died organically, or if he didn't have the stomach to okay, or at least to sanction for the public's purpose to put a face on the United States dropping 2 atom bombs on Japan. I'm wondering if he was like, man, I can't do that. And of course,
that is a book I have to get someday. The Strange Death of FDR by Emanuel Josephson. I can find used copies of it for like $75. I'm just not willing to go there yet.
Well, Fletcher Prouty, I'm sure Josephson is going to the same place, according to what Prouty said. And Prouty, make a long story short, because he was flying emissaries at that time. Might have even flown FDR to Malta or whatever, Yalta, one of those things. And he had said that there was an episode between Russian dignitaries led by Gromyko and Roosevelt's son, who were at Stalin's funeral, and Roosevelt's son asked of Gromyko, after all these years, he said, "Why didn't you let my mother attend the funeral?" And they said, "Because she wouldn't let us look at your father's body. We asked that we could see your father's body because we suspected that he had been poisoned by the Brits." And they said, because of that, that's one of the reasons why she wasn't invited. So, and that's a really sketchy paraphrase of the whole thing, but you can find that online as well. And that may be the case, that he was offed. And would it be true that he was off because he didn't have the stomach to do that, but Harry didn't mind? So, and that brings us to this article, You and the Atomic Bomb. One of the salient statements in this essay I'm just going to read, and it said, "And though I have no doubt exceptions can be brought forward, I think the following rule would be found generally true, that ages in which the dominant weapon is expensive or difficult to make will tend to be ages of despotism, whereas when the dominant weapon is cheap and simple, the common people have a chance." Did he call that?
And he was so ahead of the curve. People at that time, with that bomb having just been implemented and invented, nearly everybody was thinking it's the end of the world. We're all going to blow each other up. And Orwell was right. He said, no, we're not. In that essay, he said, we're going to have a period of stasis, of a horrible stability now of 2 or 3 unconquerable entities, oligarchical regimes, who they will make a tacit agreement with one another not to blow each other up in order to preserve their own power. And he was right. And, of course, he fleshed that idea out a lot more later on in 1984. He wrote that about 4 years ago, 4 years after this essay. But you see where he was going, as early as 1945.
Well, there's some that contend that he had already written 1984 and make references to it. I don't know that it's that important, but yeah, however that goes. And in fact, here's where he states, more and more obviously the surface of the earth is being parceled off into 3 great empires, each self-contained and cut off from contact with the outer world, and each ruled under one disguise or another by a self-elected oligarchy, is what you had mentioned. Now, people will say, well, we're not cut off because we have radio and TV and all this stuff. Well, you are cut off because you only see the images that they want you to see.
Yeah, did you notice he writes about that later in the essay? He writes how he records how the airplane was, when that was invented, was supposed to erase borders. Wow, we can fly over borders now. The traveling is so much easier. There aren't going to be any more borders. And he noted how up till that time, what the airplane really did was make borders stronger. Because if you think about it, with airplanes now, they can surveil borders. They can fly over and see anybody who's crossing a border. And now you can also bomb your neighbor, so that enforces the border. And then he wrote how radio was supposed to also erase borders. And then he notes, no, radio is just going to be used for propaganda to reinforce borders.
All right. And Theo, this is what you're talking about. He writes, we were once told that the airplane had abolished frontiers. Actually, it is only since the airplane became a serious weapon that frontiers have become definitely impassable. The radio was once expected to promote international understanding and cooperation. It has turned out to be a means of insulating one nation from another. So there you go.
Bingo. Did you notice he uses the phrase Cold War at the end there?
Yeah.
I don't know that he coined that phrase, but he's one of the first. This is 45. That's pretty early on to be using that word.
Yeah, I would think it might have been from him. It might have also been from Burnham, who he obviously has written about. Very interesting guy, and there's a whole lot of different faces to Burnham, but they may have concocted that as well, along with Leo Strauss and George Kennan, because they cooked that whole thing up. So you got to wonder, were they supposedly patriots or whatever, or good Americans because they came up with this whole scenario of a Cold War to fill that vacuum between the end of World War II and Korea, and then after Korea through to Vietnam. So in essence, we're always at war, always.
It's obvious from reading that book, Who Paid the Piper by Francis Saunders, that James Burnham and George Kennan, who you just referenced, and those two, for some reason, they're always spoken of together.
Yeah, they joined
but they were intelligence operatives.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, here's another thing that's interesting, and I've sent this around a couple of times in emails, and I don't know, I guess it doesn't really hit anybody like it hit me, but here's the point. The idea that Orwell had about the three empires, as far as being published about being out in the public domain, he was not the first. Who was the first was Robert U. Benson in his futuristic book, Lord of the World. And
that's the Romanist one, right?
Yeah, he was an Anglican turned Roman Catholic. What the heck's the difference?
That's not a surprise.
Right? But he came from a very literarily astute family, a bunch of writers that came out of that household, including his father and a brother, maybe another brother or whatever. But he wrote that book in like 1904, and in it he talked about the three empires. Now, what's interesting about that book is the war he envisions is in the 21st century, and the war he envisions takes place before. I mean, we're not even involved in World War I or II yet, and he died somewhere, I think, in the late 30s. The point being is that before there was ever a World War I or II, Benson wrote about a war in the 21st century with three empires: the Asian Empire, Europe, and America. So what I'm wondering is not it's okay with me if Orwell riffed off Benson's idea, but was Orwell, Benson, and even Alfred Mackinder all aware of what was going on at that time at the turn of the century? Because Mackinder also wrote about what would have to happen for a final empire to run the show, and that involved the whole idea of World Island, the landmass between Vladivostok and Lisbon, needing a pivot point called the Heartland. Brzezinski riffed off that in 94 with the Grand Chessboard. All right, so here's where I'm going with this. What did these individuals know? What were they privy to that they would come up with the same idea about a futuristic war with three power domains out of the city of London?
Well, some of those guys I think you quoted were writing for Foreign Affairs, the CFR publication, and Orwell was reading Foreign Affairs, at least.
Well, Mackinder, I know, came out with a look back at his Heartland theory, and that you can read that online. That comes from an issue of Foreign Affairs somewhere in the 40s. But when he originally came up with that, when Mackinder was talking about this, Mackinder is considered the first geopolitician because he looked obviously at the world differently than what we look at it with our own biases. Who was writing about what back then? That's what gets me, is that you're talking about the first decade of the 20th century, and these guys were just open to that. So if Orwell read Mackinder,
this is when the CFR was still, for all practical purposes, a secret society. Today, it's kind of they've come out of the closet. They'll make appearances on like Fox News and say, "Yeah, a member of the CFR." Back then, you had to really have some connections to know about the CFR.
But isn't it the way that the more an organization grows and the more powerful it gets, it seems to bring in, here we go with more being a distraction. Like we were talking about more information. Well, you get more members in, but they don't all know what's going on. Most of them are porch members. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's a buffer between the core.
Like Blue Lodge Masons.
Yeah, they don't know what's going on. Yeah, I mean,
or your average Roman Catholic.
But so my point is that, for instance, I had a discussion with Christina Borgeson, who wrote an article and also edited the book Into the Buzzsaw, if I remember that correctly. And I was not very high in the CFR, and she was like, "Well, CFR isn't that bad." That's why I always wondered about her. And she talked about Lucy Commissar, who wrote a book about terror, money, and banks and stuff. And she says, "Well, she's a member of the CFR." I said, "Okay, great. All right, fine. She doesn't know what's going on. Okay, that's good." But that's my point, though. You get in. You can have like 3 tiers. Your porch members, your inner members, and then really the ones who make things happen. And remember, the CFR did not come out. It was not begun until after the publication of Lord of the Worlds. What does the CFR come in at? Like 1915 or something like that?
Yeah, right around that era when we got the Federal Reserve and the 16th Amendment. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a fun time, wasn't it?
Wonderful time.
That's
really, also 1917. That's when Woodrow Wilson passed the War Powers Act, or he was told to pass it.
Well, there's another interesting connection with manipulated elections. Today they want to manipulate elections by propaganda. I mean, for instance, showing the president in a better light, and they go back and forth. They did it like expertly in this last one. There's a time when he has to take a lot of criticism and he looks bad, and then all of a sudden he jets forward. And it's just this fake horse race. But that's how you manipulate people. And as somebody said, and I wish I could remember his name, that when they have, he said, whoever comes out ahead in the very last poll that is conducted before the election, that's who's going to win. And this individual based this on the fact that most people want to vote for the winner so they can say, I voted for the winner. Like, I have it together. I'm very astute. I knew who was going to win. And I believe that to be true. I think that whole manipulation failed with Clinton and the 2 Bush elections, where they had to pull off some shenanigans. And with Clinton, it was bringing back Perot into the race, because with Perot's absence, when he dropped out, Daddy Bush came back heavily in favor, and this is not what they wanted. So the whole idea of elections in general, like we said, I mean, okay, great, but since you're going to have them, they want you to vote for the person they, quote, selected. And you have no problem with that, right?
That's how they do it. And if you don't vote for the person that they selected, then they'll just covertly change your vote without you knowing about it.
And going back, and I got a little sidetracked there, but the situation with getting Wilson in, well, Taft was going to run against Wilson, and I guess they did not want Taft to be the incumbent. So they brought Teddy Roosevelt out of mothballs, who had been a Republican along with Taft, and run him on the Progressive Party. He was so popular that Wilson and Teddy both stomped Taft. It was, I think, the only loss of an incumbent, and I can't remember what the other proviso was in there. But, I mean, he just got beat to death. So who won? Wilson. That's who they wanted. That's where they brought Teddy out to siphon votes off the Republican Taft. So that there was a way of manipulating. And the other election manipulation I'm thinking about, Rutherford B. Hayes winning that election after supposedly he lost. And what they did would later become so very reminiscent with what took place in 2000. Hayes looked like he had lost to Tilden. So there were 3 states that were going to be contested as far as the voting counts. One of them was Louisiana, the other was Florida, and I can't remember the third. So they sent supposed impartial committees down to have recounts.
Garfield was one of those guys.
Garfield led the Louisiana contingent. Yeah, he's a Republican, right? Who's going to, oh no, we'll be honest.
Yeah, right.
Right, so what did they do? They sent Baker down here. Whose other bony rear end did they send down to Florida? I can't remember. Supposedly, was it Warren? What's his face? That old fossil. All right, never mind. But are you kidding me? So they sent the Republicans down to do a recount in Louisiana, and what do you know? Rutherford B. Hayes won, and he got the election. So there's another sloppy manipulation that didn't work out, so they had to steal it.
But there was a deal struck that if the armies were taken out of the South from the Reconstruction, right?
Well, in another interesting chapter, there were a lot of things that they were not happy. The federal government was not happy with the South still, and they reinstituted military or martial law down here, or you can call it martial rule, military rule if you want to be specific. And they had them, yeah. I mean, and they sat on most of the 11 states. Tennessee got a pass in this, so it was really 10. And they sat on the 10 states until they also ratified the 13th and the 14th Amendment. So, yes, and I'll tell you what, living down here, I will tell you that most crackers I talk to who are generational Floridians and Southerners, losing the war was one thing, but the military rule, after the states were admitted back in as peaceable, after that happened in the Reconstruction Acts, that's something that does not sit well.
When virtually nobody is taught what really took place for that Reconstruction Act. Even the name itself is an Orwellian political euphemism. There was no reconstructing about it. It was a reconquering.
Yeah, and I mean they had already been allowed back in. They admittedly were peaceable nations, states now, and what happened was they got reinvaded again. And the Informer will say also that military rule that was used that time has never really been released.
And whatever vestiges, whatever remnants were left of the 1787 Constitution were forever destroyed with that Reconstruction, because they threw out, the Northern Rump Congress threw out lawfully elected representatives of the South that were brought back in and had already voted to ratify the 13th Amendment, but when they wouldn't ratify the 14th Amendment, they were unlawfully thrown out. And that 1787 Constitution guarantees every state a Republican form of government. And when you deny that to one state, you deny it for them all, so the contract is void from that point.
All right, we're going to have to hold it right there, and we're not crazy. Check out what we said.